and have a nice trip, Sanmi.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Best regards to you, and it's very nice.
See you in Moscow.
Okay, yes. Okay. So it's very nice that you have mentioned the technology transfer aspect, because actually we, as the National Committee of Brics Research, we carry a lot of projects at the moment concerning the technology transfer, not only in medicine. We have very good relations, and the proposals from the institute that is the Essential Research Center in methodology and production of different types of vaccines in microbiology. And this institution, Gamaleya Institution, was the first who suggested to the world the anti-COVID-19 vaccination. And actually, they have developed this project, and they have new types of protection for COVID-19. There are also Ebola vaccinations and different type of other BCG vaccinations and against cancer. And within the immunology, a lot of problems are being decided by themselves and suggested to the society. The other institution, that is the National Research Institute of Public Health, is deeply involved in harmonization of requirements for circulation of medicines and medical devices in Brics countries. Another project is just a project, a kind of the multilateral, because it's with participation of the Gulf countries, of China, of India. They are involved in cancer and heart diseases, and there are a lot of interesting projects that are suggesting for different types of technology transfer. Within the Russian Academy of Science, the Russian Academy of Science is the main shareholder of our national committee. There are also important projects concerning solving the environmental and fuel and energy projects, and the leading scientist within that is just Professor, Doctor of Technology, and a member of different academies, not only the Russian one. He contributed greatly to space technology, and actually his professional and the scientific interests within the energy problems. Our Brazilian colleagues are interested in developing relations, just as an example, on the basis of the technology that the Russian Academy is suggested. Then there is a Korean Scientific Center. We have a lot of regional centers, as I have mentioned, Biomed, the multinational technology center, and it's in Tomsk. And the Korean Scientific Center, they are they have suggested the important project for mining operations and agricultural biotechnology structure. Then there are several educational centers that are under supervision. So let's put it like that medicine is one of the important aspects, as I have mentioned, the vaccination, and not only, but there are a lot of others, and we have the possibility to listen to Sarmei, who attracted her attention to climate change and problems. And actually, I would like to pass a word to Professor Matone, the professor of the KwaZulu-Natal University. And another important aspect will be highlighted. It's just the community engagement and community psychology in peacekeeping. Yeah. Welcome, please, Professor. And we so guide us just to prepare questions, taking this opportunity. Okay.
Good morning, colleagues, and in this room, as well as those on social media and on Zoom. I am presenting on community engagement and community psychology in peacekeeping, an interface of perspective. I don't know if my slide is visible. Let me see if I have to change this. Share the screen now. There it is. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Maybe as a way of introduction, let me just indicate the fact that within the context of this project, my interest is particularly looking at the psychological security of communities within peacekeeping operations. Now, if we talk about the concept of security, within the psychology discipline and field, security has been a long-standing matter from as far early as the theory of Maslow, who indicates that security is a basic human need. And so to other theories like Bowlby, who talk about attachment and the implication of attachment theory on security, that human beings basically are inclined to want to feel secure in order for them to develop optimally. And so I just want to begin that distinction from that vantage point. And then particularly then look at security within peacekeeping operations. I want to premise my discussion about security within peacekeeping operations on the work of Bartal and Jacobson in 1998. They proposed that when we speak about security, we need to look at it within the context of psychological security as well. And so, next slide is not moving. And so they talk about a differentiation between security as an objective phenomenon and security as a subjective phenomenon. This distinction between objective and subjective rests on, as an objective phenomenon, security is seen as something which is out there, which can be measured and assessed, and factors that influence it can then be determined. But then as a subjective phenomenon, security is looked as not happening independent of the person that is being involved in the security context. And so, for instance, the subjective phenomenon of security says that an individual has got perceptions about whether they are feeling secure or whether they are not feeling secure. And therefore, you cannot look at security without acknowledging the role that people's personal perceptions have on how secure they feel about an environment. And so they assert that security, therefore, is a cognitive process. And by cognitive process, they talk about the idea that when you look at any phenomenon, it can be an object, it can be a process that's happening. It is out there, it's happening out there. However, you need to bring it internally. You interpret it, you internalize it, and you use your own cognitive processes to understand that phenomenon and therefore decide on how you evaluate that particular phenomenon. And so there are three processes you identify, you perceive from the inside and outside activity. You interpret from your internal belief reservoir, and then you attach meaning to that particular activity. And so this theory speaks also to the idea of security. People will have their own perceptions of how secure they feel based on their interpretation of that event, but also based on the resources that they have internally to be able to see whether that phenomenon is a threat for them or whether it's not a threat on them. And so the idea then of psychological security, according to these authors, is that we should not only, when we look at security from the military perspective, only look at political factors or societal factors or even economic factors, which is the mainstream way of trying to understand security within the military context. But they also argue we need to include the psychological aspect. So it becomes a holistic focus on security that includes all aspects and all facets of the factors that influence what security is all about. And so I therefore argue that based on the discussion on psychological security and how the authors are presenting the concept of psychological security, I then argue psychological security is not something that can be offered to people. It is dependent on conscious and active engagement on the part of the individual, the group, or the community under consideration. And then I also argue that psychological security within peacekeeping is dependent upon the conscious and active participation of communities for which security is required. And so I move towards a more subjective understanding of security rather than an objective understanding of security. Now, this study is evolving. I have about 2 parts to the study. And one of the things that I wanted to understand was what are the current practices that are being used within peacekeeping to ensure the security of communities. And as I did the study, and I think within the context of psychological security, I came across a concept that is called community engagement, which has just recently emerged. And it is a concept and a practice that is being used in peacekeeping. I will talk more about it. So my first part of the study focuses on that concept of community engagement. And then the second part, which is not part of this particular presentation, will look at what is the impact of these practices on the psychological security of communities. Now, if we then go to the concept of community engagement, when I looked at the literature, there's quite a number of shifts that has happened within the field of peacekeeping. There's been shift from recognizing peacekeeping as a simple phenomenon to recognizing peacekeeping as having a number of dimensions to it, and therefore also having a number of multidisciplinary components to dealing with peacekeeping. There's also a shift towards protecting civilians, apart from the other core basic functions of peacekeeping. There's also been a shift from looking at peace from a negative perspective to a positive perspective. The object of peace has also shifted from a global concept to focusing more on national and local communities. And with the local focus on communities, there's been more calls for being people-centered and for community engagement approaches. And so I particularly base my conception of community engagement on a document that has recently been released by the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and they called it the practice note. It's the United Nations practice note on peacekeeping, and it focuses particularly on the concept of community engagement. And this has been promulgated in 2018, so it is a recent phenomenon, and that's why I'm interested in understanding how it fits in within the whole notion of psychological security. Since it was promulgated under the Action for Peacekeeping Initiative, it has served on annual reports of the Special Committee of Peacekeeping. So it's still a new piece of legislation and actually guidance on how to engage with communities. Now, how do they define community engagement? It's said to be a strategic process that involves local populations in all aspects of decision-making, policy development, and implementation, with the purpose of strengthening these local communities to own the process, for capacity development, and community structures, strengthening community structures, but as well as to improve transparency, accountability, and using optimal resources across different settings within the peacekeeping mission. And with the interest from focus on the psychological security of communities, I looked at one approach in psychology, which is called community psychology, which some authors argue it's both a sub-discipline, but then it's also an approach to intervening in psychological issues. This sub-discipline or approach rose as a result of concerns with the role of mainstream psychology in offering psychological services to communities, particularly looking at the fact that community or psychology as a discipline arose from the West and America and Europe. And there was a question around how relevant is the psychology to non-Western, non-European communities. And it went as far as saying, if we look at the understanding of psychology from these perspectives, it is more individualistic. And within non-Western communities, there's the whole issue around focus tends to be on communities or groups. And so how relevant that individualistic focused psychology to communal settings. And so that was how it was developed. And then it went even further. Some of the proponents of community psychology, particularly in South Africa, went as far as saying we cannot understand the concept of community psychology outside of the political environment in our context. And so they went as far as saying the issue around mental health and psychological well-being should be understood within the structures and systems within which communities find themselves. And so focus then becomes on a drive towards empowering communities. And so when I looked at this concept and the drive towards empowerment, towards looking at social structures and social systems, and I looked at this definition of community engagement as I'm presenting it here, I saw a bit of intersection in terms of the fact that focus is now on communities. And the goal is to actually empower. The goal is to actually build capacity and strengthen ownership from communities. And so that is the interest on community engagement, and how then does it compare to community psychology with the goal of trying to look at psychological security of communities. And so I try to understand the object of focus for community engagement. And this, in essence, looks at how do we define community? And I looked at the two fields, community psychology and community engagement within peacekeeping. The one concept talks about, if you see in the image there, it's about a group of people coming together with a common cause. The fact that they are holding each other's hand, they are saying we are in this together. We may be diverse, but we want to work together towards a common goal. There are other conceptions of community as people who have a common interest in a particular subject or in a particular area. And they might not necessarily be together in a physical space, but they may be connected from different countries. And one way is through technology. But then they can also be together, working collaboratively towards achieving a particular goal. But then there are other conceptions of community as a physical, geographical space. So people who live in Cape Town, in Manenberg, for instance, would be regarded as a community based on the fact that they are demarcated by a particular geographical location. Now, within the concept of community psychology, where I spoke about the notion of not understanding community outside of the political discourse, I particularly base this on the work of Richard and Sidat, and Sidat is one of the key proponents of community psychology in South Africa. And they talk about defining community in two ways. The one way is about using it as a euphemism for race or ethnicity. And they did an analysis of how the concept of community was used. And they moved, their departure point was from a political perspective to understand how psychologists have been using, and even the government then was using the concept of community. And as a euphemism, they felt that it was much more easier and much more comfortable to use that concept rather than to use the words race and ethnicity, because they were a little bit more softer and people would be able to assimilate those concepts even more. But then they also talk about the concept of an imagined community. And they were particularly saying at that time, the government was using the word community to protect the interest of people who were still perpetrating the nation of the art. And so they would then use that concept as a way of creating imagined communities that needed to be protected. And so when I look at the definitions from on the left regarding a community with common interest, a community that is working towards a common goal, geographically spaced, but then look at the political definition of community, I saw a difference between looking at community as an objective construct and looking at community as a subjective construct. And my argument then says the manner in which we define community and position it as either objective or subjective will have a bearing on how we intervene in community and the objectives that we will get from that kind of intervention. So in other words, if we look at how community engagement has defined the concept community, they have positioned it in an objective manner, that it is community out there and we are going in, we are going to support the community and assist them in doing X, Y, Z. Now, when we look at community psychology and the manner in which they positioned the concept of community, we recognize that it has been positioned as a subjective concept where communities are meant to be part of the process of defining who they are and being empowered in order to take control of situations that happen around them and to attain the state of mental well-being. And so those are the first areas that I wanted to focus on. Now, I want to then look at the principles of engagement from the perspective of community psychology and community engagement in peacekeeping. From the practice note, one of the key driving principles of community engagement states that politics must drive the design and implementation of the mandate of peace operations. And so with this, they recognize that we need to move into communities, come to the local, understand the political climate within the local, and utilize that understanding to design and to implement whatever mandate peacekeeping operations have for that particular community. And that is done through a process of inclusivity. They go into communities, they consult with community members, they recognize that as you consult, you need to recognize the diversity of voices that may be existing within the community. You might have mainstream voices, you might also have marginalized voices. The role of the person who's facilitating this community engagement process needs to take into consideration those diverse voices, but then make sure that the marginalized voices are brought into the conversation. And in terms of the marginalized voices, the concept talks about voices that may not be dominant in the discourse. And those voices may not necessarily be popular, but it's important that they also get brought into the discussion, into the engagement, so that whatever concerns that they may have should also be heard. And here, the idea is to, within the concept of peacekeeping, the idea is to allow the community to talk about the drivers of conflict and bring those drivers of conflict to the fore from their own perspective. And those marginalized voices sometimes can also include women, it can include children, it can include a whole diverse of groups within those communities. There's also the idea of collaboration. So together as whoever is leading the community engagement process has to make sure that there is that collaborative effort. And there's no way you can hear the voices without necessarily collaborating with the other who is telling you about the voices. So participation is a key issue. And there's also in community engagement, they also talk about the notion of empowerment. And as far as I understood from the practice note, their notion of empowerment means the community comes to the table, they share their own drivers of conflict, they share their own concerns around security, and therefore with that, they get to inform the design the peacekeeping missions and the interventions that are meant to be given to them as a community. So that's the part they talk about around empowerment. Now, if we look at the processes that are involved in community engagement, there are three key processes, and the first one talks to consultation. I've already alluded to that. And in that consultation, the idea is community psychology talks about needs assessment, conducting a needs assessment, understanding what the needs of the community are. And with that, the focus is on the community, is on the people. It's not on what we would like to do for the people. So it's not about a top-down approach. It's about taking it from the bottom and understanding and integrating and moving it to the top so that collaboratively there can be an understanding on how to proceed. The process also involves goal setting. So the idea is to hear the community, and together the community tells you what are our internal priorities. You may have your own priorities. We also have our own priorities. How do we then marry the two to make sure that the community's needs and concerns are also heard? There's also the issue around shaping political processes. As communities are engaged with, they are given agency to actually shape how processes within the political space emerge. There's also the issue of managing risks, because in the process, there might be risks that may emerge as there is this engagement. So it's very much important that during this community engagement process, there is also an understanding of those risks and management of those risks. And in terms of communication, the practice notes indicate the centrality of communication, and most importantly, the fact that if there isn't communication, and when we talk about security, we talk about a sense of feeling vulnerable. And so there is a notion that there might be fear of being safe. And so when there isn't much communication and there is peacekeeping troops or missions that have been deployed into a particular community, without much communication, people may begin to be fearful. There might be rumors that are being spread around people's safety and what is happening. There might even be some misunderstandings about what the role of peacekeeping is for that particular community. And so community engagement advocates for very clear and very continuous communication with communities, so that you spell out these fears, you remove the miscommunication, you remove even the issue of disinformation. Now, when I looked at the goals and the processes that I've just outlined around community engagement, I was looking at it from the point of the objective of why do we engage in communities. And the idea here is to empower the community. Now, I looked at what is empowerment. And I because in the practice note, they don't provide a deep understanding of the meaning of empowerment. And so I went into community psychology literature, because empowerment is a key term there. And the goal of community psychology is to empower communities. And so I looked at two different definitions, one by Perkins and Zimmerman, and the other one by Rapoport. If we look at the Perkins and Zimmerman definition of empowerment, it says it is an intentional, ongoing process, which is centered in the local community, and it involves mutual respect, caring, and group participation through which people lacking an equal share of valued resources gain greater access to and control over those resources. And that definition was borrowed from the Cornell Empowerment Group. And then Rapaport, on the other hand, says empowerment is a process through which people gain control over their lives and democratically participate in the life of their community. So in both definitions, what we pick up is the whole idea of a process. It is a process, it's not an event or an outcome. It's also about focusing on communities for creating control, better control over their lives. If there are lack of resources, they gain control and equal share over those resources, but then also gain control. And so when I looked at the processes of community engagement, what I picked up was within the notion of empowerment, there seems to be, the outcome seems to be partial empowerment of communities. And I base that on the fact that when you look at the processes and how they actually gain, or the goal of communication and engagement within those communities, I do not see much around the ongoing process of engaging with the communities. It is not made clear. And there's also no element, whilst there is group participation, while there is democratic participation, there hasn't been much focused on the issue around resource gain and greater control and greater access towards resources. And so that's the element that I feel needs a little bit more investigation, needs a little bit more attention to understand what empowerment actually means within the context of community engagement. And so I then went further. I tried to understand what kind of models are being utilized in community engagement. And particularly, I was looking at theoretical models for engaging in communities. And I couldn't quite find any models within the peacekeeping context. They talk about the practice notes explains the practices of community engagement. It gives us the principles, it gives us the processes, but it doesn't say much around what theoretical models are these processes of engaging in community based on. And so I looked at some of the models that are used for psychological security, the models for community psychology, and I believe these are some of the models that perhaps could be utilized within the community engagement space. And community engagement, whilst I'm referring to it now within the context of peacekeeping, we know that community engagement is used in other contexts other than the peacekeeping context. And when I looked at the literature around the use of community engagement in context outside of peacekeeping, I picked up that there was those applications utilized particular theoretical models. And so therefore, I believe it is also possible for community engagement within peacekeeping to base their engagement on specific theoretical models. And perhaps that is an area where community engagement would need to develop, would need to explore even further to try and see what is the basis of our practice of community engagement within the peacekeeping field. And so in closing, I think I've already spoken about some of these emerging issues. The manner in which the concept community is positioned, either objectively or subjectively, has a bearing on the ultimate outcome of community engagement. And as I looked at the issue of empowerment, it somewhat indicated how defining community as subjective or objective would influence how you target communities and what is the intended outcome of the community. And because empowerment was also not that clearly and explicitly defined in the community engagement context, I could not find evidence of full empowerment of communities. Hence, I said what I picked up was the notion of communities being partially empowered and not necessarily going the full swing of empowerment as explained within the context of community psychology. And then lastly, the issue of exploring the use of theory in community engagement would become important. Subsequent to the practice note as a guideline for engaging with communities within peacekeeping operations, there was another handbook that was released in 2020 that actually gave case examples of the implementation of community engagement in peacekeeping operations. They applied that to war-torn countries in Africa. Examples are the DRC, Darfur, and Central African Republic. And they utilized the model of community engagement and illustrated how that model was successfully implemented within those communities during peacekeeping. And in those, in that handbook, I got a sense that the definition of empowerment almost mirrors the definition of empowerment in community psychology. And so I get a sense that as the concept of community engagement is being implemented increasingly within peacekeeping, it is being defined and clarified. And my point is that whilst I found some gaps, and the gaps were based on the original concept note of community engagement, which only started in 2018, which was published in 2018. As I looked at further studies on implementation, I find that they are beginning to refine that concept. And so in closing, well, the limitation of my study is that I particularly focused on the practice note as a guiding document. And perhaps I may need to begin to conduct studies to look at maybe studies that actually practice and implemented community engagement to see whether some of the arguments that I'm presenting here are actually valid or not, as seen by the handbook that begins to emerge and indicate how community engagement is being presented. Now, in terms of recommendations and the way forward then, is that perhaps one of the areas in exploring the use of the word community engagement is to actually have empirical studies of community views on the impact of community engagement themselves. What has it resulted in? They have participated in the process. It might be useful to hear their views on whether they felt empowered or what was the impact of that community engagement on them. And then the second recommendation is that perhaps we need some systematic reviews of studies that were conducted on the use of community engagement and to look at whether they have been based on theory or not. And if they have been based on theory, what are the theories that they have utilized in basing their studies on? And so this is the end of my talk. And yeah, I will welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Mtona, for your profound presentation. That was extremely interesting. And Welcome to you. Probably there are some questions. Welcome to you. If possible, welcome to you.
I'm going to qualify my question by saying upfront, I'm a total ignoramus when it comes to anything psychological. But there are a couple of things that have confused me. Is one, which I really believe at every level, things have got to be developed from the ground up. But you also said it's got to be politically driven. And looking at the complexity is how quickly can you come in? And I'm glad you said that there are some case studies already. So say, for example, in one of our neighboring countries, there's some upheaval, and we've got to go in and do some peacekeeping and psychology of communities there. What politics do we interact with to get this to work? And how quickly can it happen? I mean, you want to have people feeling secure as quickly as possible. Now, I'm not questioning whether this works or not, because we do have the case studies, but I think a lot of people would like to know how would this work in a practical sense.
I think the idea of politically driven, the community engagement practice talks about politically driven from the local perspective. And so the peacekeeping will be commissioned into an area. However, what they're saying is it should not impose its own ideas and views on how to then best intervene for that community. It needs to recognize the politics around this community itself, marry the two, and then come up with a workable intervention that would satisfy both the issue of security of the community, but the concerns of the community members themselves.
So in a case like, for example, we've got gift of the givers and they went in, would you see them as the political driver?
Okay, so perhaps, okay, yes, that's a nice example that you're using. So they would be the ones who are driving the process. However, when they enter the community, it's not a vacuum. They need people that they need to connect with in the community. And that's where community engagement talks about the key people that you engage with. Let them not just be the mainstream voices, but there are other people who may be, there may be silent voices, there may be marginalized voices. Let those also be identified and therefore work together. And I think when we look at, for instance, the floods in KZN, and we look at the notion of the support that was brought in from the outside to address the issues, there were lots of concerns around, I remember there were lots of concerns around corruption. And that corruption is linked to the fact that who holds the power in the community to actually engage with the help that's coming into the communities. And that has an impact on whether there will be actual empowerment of everybody in the community, or whether it will just be for specific secluded, high-profile people in the community.
Other questions, please? Welcome. Thank you. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of the similarity with the restorative justice that we've been working in the community. And you beautifully illustrated how thinking globally about peace and justice and acting locally is very clear in what you were saying. And I was just wondering about you spoke about the community being demarcated a space in Cape Town.
It was an example.
So
Yes.
Are they not allowed to move out when you say demarcated a space to live in? So
Okay, I think I was trying to explain the different ways in which we can define community. That in some instances, community can be a group of people who've got a common cause. But community can also mean a group of people who live in a particular geographical space.
Thank you. Let me also just put several questions. The first, it concerns different type of definitions that you have suggested. And I would like probably to ask you to specify what is your what is your definition, your personal definition? What is your personal approach to it? It's the first point. And the second, linked with the first question, is that there are a lot of different communities all over the world, and certainly just public institutions should support them in their peacekeeping activity. There are some specific and universal characteristics of communities. What are the main universal ones as far as the universal approach is concerned? The first definition, the second is the universal approach.
Okay, thank you. My specific approach to the definition of community would be it's not an either or, it's an inclusive. It can be a group of people with common interest, and so we don't necessarily have to box ourselves in understanding community in one specific way. It can be diverse, and I want to acknowledge the diversity of community. And so I'm arguing that we shouldn't look at community from a parochial perspective, but we need to acknowledge that there might be different ways of defining community. And you just need to know what your definition of community is. How do you understand community? And that understanding will assist you in going into the community and knowing what is the objective of you going into that community. And so I acknowledge the diversity of how community is engaged, and I'm saying let us not use one. It can be an either or, and it can be both. It's actually both. And then in terms of the principles of community, I think the principles of community would be people who share the same interest, people who feel they've got a common goal, people who would want to have a sense of in psychology, there's what they call a sense of community. They feel they can feel safe, they belong together. It can be physically, but then it can also be emotionally. A sense of knowing that other community members can
So we can continue. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome.
So at a practical level, I think the practice note itself has given clear guidelines on how to intervene in communities. They talk about the different processes, which is, first of all, as you enter into the community, the goal is to consult, allow people to participate in the process. And so they've got quite a number of tools, they call them tools, that are being used for community engagement. And I just didn't share the tools here, but some of the tools talk about the use of technology. Some of the tools talk about having community liaison assistance. So you appoint these people in the community to go into the community and engage with the community. We also have monitoring systems of the different maybe meetings or consultation sessions, and you record all those issues. So they do give a practical way of how to actually go into communities, engage with communities, and assist them.
Thank you very much indeed. Any other questions? Welcome.
I'd like to add something, part of my studies in psychology in undergrad, we took community psychology as some of the modules. And one of the most realistic, I would say, events that happened where I personally saw maybe an implementation or very quick put together of community psychology was actually, and I spoke about it to some colleagues as well, was the looting that happened a while back. And during that time, and I'll speak about my community without saying exactly where I'm from, but people came together and we stood on roadside. And there's a whole other conversation to say who these people that came together in communities were defending or fighting against. That's a totally different thing, and why those people were motivated. But what we saw during the looting was those community members came together, were on roadsides. They figured out where their defensible points are in communities. Again, who and why they, that's a different thing. But we also saw community members who were working with members of the community policing forum. They were also engaging with, in my area anyway, the local security contractors and security forces. And again, I never ever want to see another situation where we are putting community against community, in that sense, against people of our own country. I don't ever want to see that again, but I think it does demonstrate that should a situation like that arise, all over Durban, people will come together to keep each other safe. I just hope that we don't see people motivated again to act in that capacity should that need arise. I don't want to see that again, but it does demonstrate a lot of the points that you covered as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So can we move forward? Oh, there was a question online. So just will be so kind as just to present yourself and put your question, please. There is Professor Chu.
Morning.
Professor Wanda. Okay, welcome, please, Professor.
Hello, may I talk? Hello, may I talk?
I hear you. Yeah, we hear you. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Professor Mutane, thank you for presenting an interesting aspect into the concept of psychological security in the times of peacekeeping. Now, as you all know, peacekeeping forces in the late 19th century and carrying on in the late 20th century and it's carrying on in the 21st century. But it has its own setbacks. Now, if you look at globally the deployment of peacekeeping forces, say by United Nations in Africa and previously in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there were allegations, and even in places like Haiti, there were allegations of excesses committed by these so-called peacekeeping forces, including gender-based violence and molestation of women and so on. So the aspect of psychological security has now been mainly lost because, first of all, while community participation and public participation is extremely important. Sorry, can you all hear me?
Yeah, we do hear you. Welcome.
Okay. While community and public participation is extremely important in any government deployment of peacekeeping forces, the community has lost its faith in deployment of such forces, mainly because of distrust in the political forces that brings us about. Firstly, we have to contend with imperialistic forces, like say French forces deployed in Mali, and there's imperialistic motives or neo-imperialistic motives. Then we have the concept of have and have-nots in our community, especially here in South Africa. And you may recall during the July riots last year, or was it year before, this concept of time, you find that there's great distrust between the security forces who are supposed to keep peace in the community and the community itself. Then the third aspect is the racial segregation and racial division of attitudes and suspicion. For example, you find that, again, if you refer to the July riots in South Africa, you find that the attacks were ignored by the security forces and the police, for whatever reason we don't want to go into now. But the businesses and the places that were targeted were perceived to belong to capitalistic forces who are exploiting the underprivileged and the have-nots. So while this concept of psychological security is extremely important, is it really applicable in third world countries and developing countries where there's great corruption, there's great mistrust, and there's great vested interest as to what is going on? Firstly, from the imperialistic peacekeeping force motives, and secondly, from the racial implications that go with peacekeeping. And thirdly, if the government or if the authorities allow these sort of looting rampages to continue unabated in our community. And this actually obviates or precludes public participation in such initiatives that may be carried out in good faith with deployment of peacekeeping forces by various governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your comments and questions. From within the peacekeeping space, you talk about lack of trust and you make reference to gender-based violence. And I want to believe those are some of the reasons why we have this shift in peacekeeping towards being people-centered, because there was that recognition that there was a lot of pain that was caused by the actual peacekeepers themselves onto the communities. And so automatically there is that tension between the community and the peacekeeping forces that are being deployed into the communities. And so that's why the whole idea of let it be inclusive, let it focus on the needs of the communities, let communities indicate for themselves or what are the points of contention regarding drivers of security and drivers of conflict. And that's where then they would be able to talk about, women would come out, for instance, and talk about them not feeling safe around the peacekeepers. And so together, a solution would be sought to try and address this issue. Looking at, and I think it's maybe before I move on to the other issues, I think it's a process. We need to look at this as a process. And I think even the definition of empowerment talks about this as a process. We need to look at it as a process that cannot happen overnight. It needs to start somewhere with a particular goal and with clear strategies on how the goals will be achieved. And in psychology, that's how we work. We work in terms of process. It's things are not just an event that can just happen, because we acknowledge that for something to happen, a psychological condition to happen, it happens over time. It takes a few processes to get that process take place. And so it will take another process to get it to be undone or to be resolved. And so I think we need to appreciate the fact that it will be a process, but as long as we recognize it and we put in place structures and mechanisms of dealing with it. If we look at the whole notion of the haves and the have-nots, and the ratio division of attitudes and suspicion, you know, as I was working on this, Prof, I was thinking of whether there is a concept called community resilience, because I'm thinking that might be an area that we would need to explore, to look at safety of communities, look at resilience within communities and how they are able to cope with all these challenges. I think as a country, and I will use our country as a point of reference, as a country, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot, but I do believe that our communities are very resilient. And I'm interested in exploring a resilience scale for communities to see how we are able to cope in the midst of all these challenges that we've been faced with for so many times. And so I think, Prof, one area is to really look at the area of resilience within communities, what makes them to be so resilient and to cope and to be able to move on despite all these hardships that are happening. And I think I see a question in the chat which talks about clarifying the importance of economic participation in security in light of improving access and control to resources, especially in the context of previous uprisings of destruction and looting, and those still coming. And I think just to link the issue around community resilience and your question, it's a reality that South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. And we keep struggling with that gap between the haves and the have-nots. And it's a gap that I don't think will be very easy to achieve, because I believe it rests a lot on political will. I believe if there is a political will from the government to try and manage the resources such that we address the haves and the have-nots, until we do that, I don't think we will win that battle. And so perhaps it's a challenge to us as community psychologists to actually find ways of how to engage with communities, to empower them for the transfer of resources. And for me, it would be internal resources. And that is why I talk about the concept of community resilience. It would be internal resources that we need to have in order to deal with situations. Because remember, when I started, I said security is a subjective concept which depends very much on our own perceptions of the concept of security. And so I think it's an area that needs a lot of work. And
it attracts a lot of interest here. Thank you very much. Probably there was another question from our virtual participants.
Morning. Hello?
Yeah, I have understood. But anyway,
Just-
probably there some other questions. Yeah. You would like to add something, yeah?
Just two comments. One
Yeah.
on community resilience. The important part of community resilience is firstly being in community. Like you said, you can define community in various ways. But in South Africa, we don't have a South African community when you speak of community resilience. Different communities will have different levels of resilience or need for resilience. So given social ills, the different communities will have different levels of those social ills. So if there's load shedding, for example, the different communities are affected differently by load shedding, even though it's applied to every citizen in the country, but different communities experience it differently, and the consequences are slightly different. So there's a lack of feeling of community as a collective, as a country, and I think it's going to be the same with the different countries within Brics as well, given that equality in all these different nations is, particularly in South Africa, which we're the worst in terms of economic inequality, is that whether you define it as geographically, as economically, or as race, in all those categories, you have fragmentation in inequality, and there's a clear have and there's a clear have not, and their level of resilience is going to be different. We've come a long way, so certainly in terms of economic empowerment for everyone in the country, which I think has been a huge improvement from what we saw in the 90s during regime change till now. But I think the key thing here is narrative. So how do we see media participating in narrative where we can clearly define? I mean, I hear people worried about corruption, etc. Without all of that is true, but when you tell bad news and not the level of improvement that there has been, you can take away community resilience very quickly. So despite the ground that we've gained from the 1990s, from 94 till present, can be completely destroyed by one narrative, someone just saying, making a comment that in apartheid was much better than where we are now. And it just changes the whole dynamic. Just a comment, you're welcome to engage on that.
Thank you very much for your contribution, but will you be so kind as just to present yourself?
So can you repeat that?
Be so kind as to present yourself.
Oh, my name is Thokozani Nxumalo. I'm a master's student at the university.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor, would you like?
Thank you, Thokozani, for your input. I think you make very valid points and very interesting contributions. I think from my perspective, I do agree with you about different conceptions of community and different levels of resilience within communities. But then I think my particular interest is actually to look at these different married communities and how they define resilience from their perspective, to check whether there are no common indicators even across the different communities of what constitutes resilience for them. I take that point that they will be different, but I'm more interested in finding out if there are specific indicators even within these different communities of what constitutes resilience. And I agree with you 100% around the issue of the media and how things are communicated. Yeah, I think let me stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, that was really good.
I wish to add one more thing without
Comment,
the
question?
but the one thing that the people were speaking to was actually how the haves and the have-nots. And what we're talking about with the have-nots is impoverished, marginalized communities. I would rather say, instead of haves, I would rather say those with power, influence, and information. They are able to weaponize communities that are marginalized to their will. And it's dangerous. And I think if we're not able to build capacity in communities, we can't give communities the option to make their own decisions and say, hey, I would rather not be a part of that. I would rather take another way. And I think building capacity is a way to prevent this from happening in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Probably we're a bit tired. We've walked a lot, and probably we are really a bit tired. So let's have a short interval, for coffee, if you don't mind, for several minutes. 15 minutes is enough. Yeah? Okay, just an interval. Thank you for the participants online, and just keep online.
in 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See, Mr. Google knows I'm in Africa. No, Microsoft Bing.
Okay, please, we're about to continue, and there is a question left and addressed to Professor Matfune. As far as I understand, it's Professor Wada, yeah, would like to add something and probably to put another question. Professor Wada, are you online?
Yes, Chair, I'm online. I don't want to delay the proceedings of this excellent webinar. So I thought I'll just submit it in writing, but perhaps you might be having a combined panel discussion towards the end, or is that not on the agenda? But if you'd like me to elaborate on this, it's fine. But as I mentioned, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Thank you.
So then we can continue, yeah? Yeah, we'll continue. Yeah, and just I would like to present another speaker, and it's Ms. Sharma from India. She participates in our roundtable online, and her presentation is dedicated to threats and just over critical offshore and onshore energy problems, yes, as far as I understand. So just welcome, please. Ms. Sharma, are you online?
Thank you, Professor Ina. Yes, I'm online. I'll quickly share my screen.
So we see you and your presentation also. Welcome.
Perfect. So, shall I start?
Yeah, please.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect. Thank you for the confirmation. Very good morning to all the esteemed delegates attending this roundtable conference. Greetings from India. My name is Gargi Sharma and I am from New Delhi, India. I have recently completed my master's in international relations from Amity University in New Delhi. While pursuing my postgraduate degree, I got the opportunity to visit Russia as a research fellow as part of Brics educational internship program organized by Far Eastern Federal University based in Vladivostok, Russia. And it was from February 2020 to July 2020, which was the peak COVID time, with 25 fellows from all the 5 Brics nations. I got the opportunity to work on energy cooperation among Brics nations under the supervision of Dr. Victoria Panova, who was the managing director of the National Committee of Brics Research and the provost for international relations of the Far Eastern Federal University. I have been associated with Dr. Nirmala Gopal since 2020 when I participated in the Brics International School in Moscow, and Dr. Gopal was invited as the esteemed speaker there. My areas of interest include counterterrorism and securing critical offshore and onshore oil and gas infrastructure. I'm here to share my findings on India and Brics nations' energy security vulnerabilities. Just a disclaimer that my home's Wi-Fi internet is acting up a bit, so I've connected with my mobile hotspot. So if my voice breaks, please feel free to interrupt and I repeat. So as the title suggests, my paper attempts to examine the energy security vulnerabilities of India, and it seeks to assess the threats to its critical offshore and onshore oil and gas infrastructure in the Indian Ocean. However, we will also try to examine the topic keeping Brics nations in mind. So India has traditionally been a maritime nation. The subcontinent's maritime legacy dates back thousands of years, with a long coastline of more than 7,500 kilometers, 9 states situated along the coast, and millions of lives depending upon maritime sector. the sea plays a key role in India's economy even today. Having nearly two-thirds of its borders surrounded with water and over 95% of the trade being carried out via sea routes, India's dependence over its waters is fairly high. Owing to the expansive baseline, the country is fortunate to possess an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, of nearly 2.7 million square kilometers. This exclusive economic zone contains a number of energy and natural resources, including oil, gas, and coal. Exclusive economic zone is defined under the 1982 United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea, UNCLOS. So it is defined as an area of the ocean extending up to 200 nautical miles immediately offshore from country's land coast, in which that country retains exclusive rights to explore and exploit the natural resources. So the area that you see in green in the picture in the slide is the exclusive economic zone of India. India has the categorized offshore development area in its exclusive economic zone to explore and to exploit the natural resources for economic gains. And a number of private as well as state-owned companies have set up their installations in these offshore development areas for this purpose. Now, on the one hand, the great waters serve as a great gateway to prosperity in the form of trade, commerce, opportunities. But on the other hand, they also pose a serious challenge to the peace and security of the country. There are non-traditional threats such as maritime terrorism, piracy, armed robbery. They have been on the rise in the maritime space in the last few decades, and which can be attributed to the ignorance of littoral states as well as maritime law enforcement agencies towards maritime security. Now, perceiving maritime space as an extension of their theater of operations, these illicit non-state actors have been making good use of this sea blindness, and they have been targeting offshore assets, including the critical energy infrastructure, as well as the vessels for nefarious financial and political gains. So the energy sector is of critical importance to sustain the industrial and economic growth of any country. And for an energy deficient country like India, the well-being of energy-related infrastructure becomes extremely crucial, because any disruption in this sector can lead to serious impact on the country's growing economy. And this is why energy security is at the core of India's foreign policy approach. The biggest share of India's domestic energy resources is found in these offshore development areas located in the exclusive economic zone, which makes it even more important to ensure the safety of these offshore assets standing in the seas. India's offshore energy infrastructure comprises of western and eastern offshore development areas. In the picture, you can see the western offshore development area includes Mumbai High North, Mumbai High South, Mukta, Bassein, Neelam, Panna, Tapti, Hira, Lakshmi, and Gauri, whereas the eastern offshore development area includes Mahanadi, Kaveri, and Krishna, Godavari. Now, along with the domestic onshore and offshore resources, the country imports a huge amount of oil and natural gas via international shipping lanes across Indian Ocean to meet its energy needs. India also exports the refined petroleum and petroleum products to other countries after the processing. Therefore, considering the total oil imports by sea, by offshore oil production, and by petroleum exports, so the country's cumulative sea dependence for oil is somewhere estimated to be about 93%. The country seeks to encourage domestic and international cooperation with foreign oil and gas companies in order to boost the energy drive. Hence, the Indian subcontinent's energy requirement is highly dependent upon seas. The Indian Navy, as well as the maritime security agencies, are very well familiar with this sea dependence, and they are responsible for the protection of fixed and mobile offshore assets and vessels carrying oil and gas. However, there's maritime terrorism. So very few terrorist activities against offshore critical energy infrastructures have been reported in the past. And the reason for that is the underreporting or the lack of sufficient skills and technologies owned by terrorist organizations. But with time, they have evolved. They have become more inventive, resourceful, more advanced in technological terms. These non-state actors now possess some of the most advanced and state-of-the-art technology now, including GPS, including satellite communications and weaponry. So, and a number of skilled professionals joining these terrorist organizations makes the threat very imminent in the near future. They seek to deliberately create disturbance, exploit vulnerabilities, and constantly search new targets to spread fear, as well as to disrupt the smooth functioning of an economy. Now, offshore and onshore energy infrastructure serves their purpose very well because, one, it has the ability to directly impact the economy. Second, with the minimal risk of being caught. In the past few years, there have been multiple cases where terrorist groups have targeted energy infrastructure in several countries. The most recent ones have been a series of missile and drone attacks on the oil facilities of the oil giant Saudi Aramco, which belongs to the world's biggest oil exporter, Saudi Arabia. And the attack was conducted by the Saudi Arabia's neighbor Yemen's Houthi rebels. In September 2019, two Saudi oil refineries, Abqaiq and Khuraiz, were attacked, which resulted in production halt and prolonged disruption. The oil processing facility was damaged, with the cost of repairs going up to hundreds of millions of US dollars. Aramco oil exports were disrupted by around 5.7 million barrels a day. Once again, in March 2021, an oil storage yard at Ras Tanura, which is the site of an oil refinery and the world's biggest offshore oil loading facility, it was attacked with the intention of targeting the stability and the security of global energy supply. Now, if Yemen's Houthi rebels were able to carry out such advanced drone attacks against the energy infrastructure, the other terrorist organizations all over the world can do even worse. Now, let us try to assess the potential threat to one of India's states, Gujarat. Gujarat ranks first in the production of crude oil. If we go in numerical terms, onshore 55%, and crude oil onshore 55%, natural gas onshore is 32%. The state has the highest number of oil and gas fields, onshore and offshore. And it has a highly vulnerable 1,600 kilometer long porous coastline, which has installations of vital economic significance. It has the longest coastline among all Indian states, total 48 ports along 1,600 kilometers long coastline, including one major port at Kandla and other minor ports. The Gulf of Kutch that you can see here, it houses two major oil ports, Mundra and Kandla, which lie very in the close vicinity of Pakistan. Now, Mundra is one of the largest ports in the country, and it is run by Adani Group, whereas Kandla port is a large bulk handling facility. Most of the India's oil imports are sourced from Persian Gulf, and Gujarat ports serve as the closest point to Persian Gulf, so they are the best ports. Kutch region also includes some refineries, some of the biggest refineries. So we have Reliance Industries Jamnagar Oil Refinery, which is a 50 million ton refinery, largest in the world. Then there is Naira Energy Refinery, which was formerly known as SR Refinery, which is located at Wadinad, Gujarat. It has the capacity of 11 million tons. And then there's Gujarat Refinery. Now, with so many critical installations in one place, the Kutch is clearly a highly sensitive region, or rather a gunpowder keg of the country. Any attack on any of these installations in the same fashion as conducted by Houthis on Saudi Aramco can be disastrous for the Indian energy industry. India has witnessed several terrorist attacks in the past, and terrorism is not going to end anytime soon. And India, and in fact, all the Brics nations with their strong stand against any kind of terrorist activities, stand in the category of enemy, and they may fall prey to the vicious tactics of the illicit non-state actors. Offshore energy installations, particularly oil and gas infrastructure, are scattered all over the exclusive economic zone. They are highly vulnerable, they are hardly defensible due to their remoteness, because they tend to be a more attractive target for the non-state actors. Now, assuming that the main goal of the attack is economic loss, the non-state actors may consider attacking the offshore structures because they may not lead to human casualties directly, but they can prove to be fatal for the energy-dependent economy. A number of methods, including explosives in suicide boats, light aircraft, unmanned submarine bombs, ship-launched missiles are possible. Attacks on offshore energy installations can cause infrastructural, environmental damage, and also production halt. This leads to financial losses, price rise, and market fluctuations as well. Now, ultimately, all these factors contribute towards reduced confidence in a country's existing security measures, and they also affect the geopolitics and foreign relations negatively in some manner. Now, looking at the responses and the coordination at international, regional, and national level, maritime security comprises security on land and at sea. Therefore, it is a complex construct. It requires coordinated efforts from all maritime stakeholders, including Navy, including Coast Guard, port authorities, and the local community. Moreover, unlike the land borders, which can be easily demarcated, the maritime boundaries cannot be demarcated. In India, maritime security is the joint responsibility of the three-tier cordon that we have, which is Indian Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Police, as well as there are some maritime intelligence agencies and port authorities. They conduct regular exercises in the form of mock drills to assess the preparation of security agencies, to safeguard the offshore development areas, and to prevent potential contingencies such as asymmetric threat, terrorist actions, oil spill, casualty evacuation, and fire. Then there's capability and capacity development. So in the last few years, the institutions responsible for the security of the nation have begun prioritizing capability building over capacity building. So both of them are equally focused upon. It is important that the security personnel also receive proper training along with the equipment so that it is not left underutilized. Then there's maritime domain awareness and information sharing network. So the failure to locate and recognize the potential threats can lead to disastrous results. Hence, maritime domain awareness or MDA is one of the significant steps towards encouraging coordination among the regional partners. It includes coastal mapping, satellite-based tracking system, vessel traffic service, and the intention of an information sharing network is the establishment of protocols to share sensitive data related to critical installations in the maritime domain and the assessment of data requirements. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea, 1982, it provides a set of regulations for the coastal states on the issues related to the rights, responsibilities, jurisdiction in the seas. It also provides a safety protocol for the offshore infrastructure of the coastal states located in the exclusive economic zone of a country, which is located within 24 to 200 nautical miles of the baseline. The Article 56 of the convention clearly states that the coastal state has sovereign rights to establish installations in the EEZ or exclusive economic zone for the economic exploitation and exploration of the zone. However, it is important to note that establishment of an offshore installation does not change the legal status of the surrounding water. Now, this clause 1982 and its Article 60 says that the coastal state may create a safety zone around the installation. However, it shall not exceed a distance of 500 meters, except as authorized by generally accepted international standards or as recommended by the competent international organization. So if you look at the picture here, it clearly shows that there's an offshore installation in the middle. Then you have the 200-meter radius, and then there's a 500-meter radius. So this 500-meter radius is the security zone, the safety zone that a coastal state may create around the installation. The UNCLOS also informs the vessels to respect these safety zones. The agencies of the coastal state responsible for the safety of offshore infrastructure are entitled to take the preventive measures and even use force in case of violations or infringements in order to ensure the security. If they feel that there's a potential threat to any infrastructure, they may choose to temporarily suspend the right to innocent passage of foreign vessels. However, the concept of this safety zone was developed nearly 4 decades ago, 40 years ago, considering the navigational hazards, but not considering the intentional and planned attack threats. In the maritime space, 500 meters is not sufficient to operate defensive tactics. So if a suicide bombing squad boarded on an explosive-laden vessel intends to collide with any structure, it can do so within 30 to 40 seconds very easily. And even the most responsive and the rapid action security team cannot take any sensible action to detect, to communicate, or to avoid this from happening by any means. Hence, there's a serious need to extend this safety zone. Then there's International Maritime Organization. International Maritime Organization takes an active part in the counter-terrorism and capacity building coordination activities under the aegis of UN Security Council's Counter-Terrorism Committee. So the resolution adopted by IMO, International Maritime Organization, recommends a number of preventive measures if in case the safety zone is violated. However, this resolution is not binding. It is up to the states to follow or not to follow the measures. Hence, the coastal states are not entitled to take any enforcement action against the states or their vessels. No approval to extend the safety zone has been given by IMO so far. Although some coastal states have extended the safety zone limit by virtue of their domestic legislation, especially if the offshore installation consists of floating production storage and offloading units, or floating storage and offloading units. So Nigeria, for instance, has a safety zone of 3 miles around its Pennington offshore terminal. The foreign vessels are not allowed to enter the area. However, they are not legally bound to follow the extension rule. Now, looking at the Brics and maritime security, the Brics countries have recognized the importance of maritime security in countering terrorism and other transnational threats. As emerging powers with extensive coastlines and interest in the Indian Ocean region, the Brics nations have emphasized the need for cooperation in addressing the maritime security challenges, including counterterrorism. One of the major contributions of the Brics countries to maritime security against counterterrorism is the establishment of the Brics Joint Working Group on Counterterrorism. Now, this platform provides an opportunity for member countries to exchange information and to coordinate efforts to combat terrorism, including at sea, but it doesn't directly talk about anything securing the offshore installation. In addition, Brics countries have conducted joint naval exercises, maritime patrols, in order to enhance their capabilities in addressing maritime security challenges, including counterterrorism. So, for instance, 2 days ago, on 17th February 2023, China, Russia, and South Africa joined a naval exercise codenamed as MOSI-2 in the Indian Ocean, with the aim to safeguard peace and stability in the region and to protect the sea lanes for commercial ships amidst its intensive efforts to restore exchanges and cooperation with the foreign countries. Similarly, India, Brazil, South Africa Maritime, IPSAMAR, is a joint multinational maritime exercise between the Indian, Brazilian, and South African navies, which takes place regularly and which recently was held in South Africa from 10th to 12th October 2022. In 2018, the navies of China and South Africa also conducted a joint exercise in the South Atlantic Ocean. So there are multilateral cooperation platforms and maritime exercises that take place, but there's nothing that Brics as an alliance together does. Besides that, the Brics countries have also prioritized the development of maritime infrastructure, including ports and shipping lanes, to enhance their economic and strategic interests. This infrastructure is very critical to ensure the security of maritime infrastructure. So the Brics countries have also prioritized the development of maritime infrastructure, including ports and shipping lanes, in order to enhance their economic and strategic interests. This infrastructure is critical for ensuring the security of maritime trade and to prevent terrorist activities such as piracy, smuggling. But unlike land, the maritime boundaries cannot be covered with artificial barriers and walls. And despite constant vigil and despite dedicated efforts, it becomes very difficult for the three-tiered cordons to conduct patrolling and surveillance due to vast oceans and inadequate resources. The offshore and onshore energy infrastructure is highly critical to the economy and to the ecology of the countries. Therefore, there's a need of proactive consideration by the policymakers, and new policies must be developed in time so that any future attacks can be prevented. The technological advancement of the non-state actors and their gradual shift of focus from land to sea is alarming, and the tendency of neglecting potential maritime threats may deeply impact national security. Hence, it is crucial to focus seawards and adopt a comprehensive approach and face the adversaries propagating in the sea with a better organized counterterrorism strategy. If we try to find a way forward, there is a need of efficient risk management framework. The majority of energy infrastructure in India and all over the world is owned by private companies. In the last 3-4 decades, they have sufficiently invested in security strengthening and risk management to follow safety protocols and to maintain consumer confidence. However, the threats have evolved with time, and it has now become crucial for the private sector to join hands with the government and the security agencies and reassess and upgrade the existing framework. There's a need to enhance the cross-border cooperation initiatives. There's an emerging need to collaborate with neighbors to implement these initiatives in the field of offshore critical energy infrastructure protection by sharing necessary security-related information and by adopting collaborative approach to prevent maritime terrorism. It may include sharing the information related to vessels of fishermen and local traders, or maybe patrolling the maritime borders. It is also very important to understand that terrorism and the intentions of the non-state actors are not confined to the boundaries of the countries. It is very crucial to come together and join hands against this. So the member states of international organizations like European Union have designed frameworks and policies to coordinate the security of critical energy infrastructure against these non-state actors. The Brics nations should also come together to strengthen the security measures with regard to critical energy infrastructure. And then there's a need to strengthen and to suggest regulations and policies. So in 2009, the request for extension of the safety zone was considered by the International Maritime Organization, but it was not approved. Now, considering today's situation, it should be extended to at least 2 nautical miles. So Brics nations should consider extending the breadth of safety zones of the offshore oil and gas installations from 500 meters to anything between 2 to 5 nautical miles in order to ensure their safety. IMO states that extension can be done on a case-by-case basis and upon the request of the coastal state. Hence, Brics should demonstrate the potential risk and request for an extension. So in conclusion, Brics countries have made significant contributions to maritime security against counterterrorism and by various initiatives, by various joint efforts. And as emerging powers, they have recognized the importance of cooperation in addressing transnational threats, and they've taken concrete steps to enhance their capabilities in this regard. But there's still a need to take some more steps and to make it even better. So with this note, I conclude my presentation here, and I would love to hear your comments and your suggestions to make it better. Thank you so much.
Ms. Sharma, thank you very much for your presentation, and I consider that there are some questions. Let me put probably one question. You have mentioned several ways of fostering just the activity, and just among them, there was the possibility of strengthening regulation and policies. What kind of regulations and policies should be strengthened if we speak about Brics? We don't hear you. Unfortunately, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. So yeah, BRICS countries can come together. In first of all, the Convention of the United Nations Laws of the Sea. It states that the safety zone can only be created for 500 meters and not beyond that. If a state wants to do that, they can do it, but it is not legally binding on the other states. So I think if BRICS nations come together and propose, they may consider it on a case-to-case basis. So, for example, I mentioned that European Union has. Am I audible?
Yeah. We see you perfectly well and hear you. Yeah, welcome.
So the member states of organizations like European Union have designed framework and policies to coordinate the security of critical energy infrastructure against the non-state actors. So I think BRICS nations can also come together to strengthen their security measures. And if IMOs and if UN CLOs conventions can be changed, we can, as BRICS nations, we can demonstrate the potential risk and we can probably request for an extension of that safety zone. So that is something that BRICS can do together. BRICS nations can come together and conduct maritime exercise together. So, I mean, these are my suggestions, but I'm sure there must be other ways of cooperation in this field.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? So let us thank you for your participation. With only one correction, Professor Panova, for more than 1 year, is not the managing director of National Brics Committee. So just she is an expert of the committee. Let me wish you well just a great success in your research. You have chosen a good subject. So then see you later. Thank you.
There's a question.
There is one question. Great. From our virtual participants, would it not be better to extend the security zone along the India, China, South Africa corridor? What do you think about?
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Sharma for excellent
presentation. Professor Wavda, well, yes, please. Probably you would like to add something?
Sorry, can you get it?
Actually, we don't hear you.
Yes.
Probably, well, yes, now it's better.
Okay. Yeah, thank you to Dr. Sharma for presenting a very worthwhile presentation. May I just raise the point? This concerns these various cross-border unhappiness and incursions between China in the north and Pakistan in the east. And I get the feeling that this is the work of certain forces which don't want to see a united BRICS nation between, say, China and India, for that matter. And has the government of India thought about this to establish a kind of secure, comfortable borders between these countries? And if they do that, then it will establish a greater region of security in Southeast Asia. Because remember, these regions are also the operational field of various third-party influences to destabilize the country, various other forces, terrorist forces, and so on, and other individuals interested in their own personal agenda, including business agenda and political agenda, and so on. So therefore, would not that be worthwhile concentrating on? And that would also secure the maritime borders all along that coast. And as it has been suggested by Mr. Malo, that we should have a combined maritime security border along Africa and India and China. Thank you. I'll appreciate your comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Gupta. And I would like to return to the question that was posed by our colleague. It's Tokozani. Will it be possible for you, well, just to speak and to present your question live, if possible? If not, then I will repeat it. There was the question of Tokozani. Yeah.
So I just wanted to know if wouldn't it be ideal to have a secured trade corridor along the Indian Ocean from India to South Africa, because we have an established trade corridor between China, South Africa, and India, and there's a lot of security threats along that route. Is there any policy regarding maybe extending, instead of working on zones, but working along that entire corridor?
Well, Sharma, be so kind as to answer this question. What do you think about?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And thank you, Professor Wavda and Numalo, for your questions. Coming on to Professor Wada's question first, India in the Indian Ocean region is a part of IORA and BIMSTEC and a number of organizations, and they are taking a number of steps to make the region secure in the form of multilateral exercises, or by being part of the counterterrorism measures of naval forces. If we talk about Pakistan, I think we have some agreements with Pakistan, because we say that they are somehow hosting the non-state actors. They say we are doing that. So I think there's a disagreement. But with China, I think, and with all the countries of the Brics and in the Indo-Pacific region, whenever it comes to terrorism, I think every country has a very strong stand against this evil. So we work in order to curb this and to mitigate the threats. Now coming on to Numalo's question, would it not be better to extend the security zone along the India-China-South Africa corridor? India and South Africa have various measures in place, and their navies conduct regular exercises in order to avoid the threat. With China, I don't think we have it any at the moment, but we can probably, as part of BRICS, I think we can bring China on board and we can do something together.
Okay.
I hope this answers your question.
Sharma, thank you very much. And if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you and our online participants for participation in the discussion, and just best regards to you. Thank you very much. And we are moving forward, and in spite of different type of activities within communities on different levels, and the participation within the energy processes, there is a burning question concerning money laundering. And the money laundering is looked after the public institutional central banks of our countries, and it is reasonable that speaking about the security problems and sharing our research, we are also paying our attention to this aspect of the activity of the entities and of the governments. And I'm happy to present Professor Sekhar from India with the presentation dedicated to money laundering in the BRICS countries. Welcome, please.
Pal, for having me here and for the kind invitation, and to the rest of the team as well. Like I said in the beginning, it's a nice opportunity to learn from each other, and I hope that will happen at the course of this week here. So thanks to Nirmala again, because this is a topic that I was not very comfortable with. And since I, as a criminologist and a victimologist, we work with other crimes, but money laundering, we always looked at as a victimless crime, because the whole country is a victim, and or a deliberate victimization kind of a crime, because you bring it on yourself, or self-victimization. So this was not my area of study and research. So I'm thankful to you for giving me this opportunity, and I hope I'll be able to do justice to this. So initially, let's just look at what we're doing at this conference in the context of the Sustainable Developmental Goals. We have so many of them: eradicating poverty, gender equality, and all this. But I really think the most important is the peace and justice, goal number 16, because we try to fit the goal of this conference and this presentation into the larger picture of the Sustainable Developmental Goals. And I think there is no justice without peace. So peace and justice, and I think it's really crucial that we look at it and as addressing the larger need of today, working and going forward. So since all of us are not on the same page, we are a multidisciplinary group here. I'd like to follow Professor Machiko and start from the basics. So let's try to answer some of these questions. What is our role as researchers? What can we do to tackle this issue of peace and security and preventing money laundering? And why are we talking about it now? And where lies the challenge of tackling this money laundering as a group, BRIC nations? Then when did we realize that BRICS needed to hold hands? And which are the ways in which we can address this challenge? And finally, the 1H, the big question: how do you change the status quo? So like I said, I set out with a lot of objectives. I wanted to study the impact of money laundering, and this is a part of a larger study. I have prepared a monograph for this project as well. So I'll just be presenting a bird's eye view of the study because of lack of time. And Professor Gopal told me that I need to make it short. So I will not go into all that, but just a little bit of what I have seen. So to analyze whether BRIC nations have coordinated and holistic national anti-money laundering strategy, and to also analyze the role of the BRIC working group on anti-money laundering and anti-corruption, and the strategies that they have adopted against money laundering. And finally, to examine the BRIC countries' adherence to the recommendations and the financial thing that was given by the UN. So I just look at all this. And of course, the methodology was, I tried to do a content analysis of the existing legislations and the salient features of the national laws related to money laundering. And the data was collected from secondary resources. And I think the limitation is not talking to people, not getting case studies. And I think this would be an opportunity. So through the course of this week, I propose to do that as well. And I tried to systematically analyze the literature on money laundering and focusing on standard journals as well. So when you look at this, we see that our nations account for 30% of the global money laundering activity. And this we see is the magnitude of the problem here. And also this was there in a report submitted by the Financial Action Task Force by the UN. So, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. We know that we haven't really got to the bottom of it, and we haven't heard about the rest of the money laundering that's happening around the BRIC nations and the other countries as well. So to go back and look at a little bit of the history, this is not something that came just in the globalized world. It was happening way back in 2000 when the Chinese traders used this getting money out of their country and then pumping it back into the legitimate institutions. And also this money laundering, it originated in Chicago. It's said, there is no proof, but it's rumored that this is where he used the laundromats that they set up all over the country, and that's how it came to be. And finally, we had this economist of Goldman Sachs who spoke about it and said that these BRIC nations, that time we did not have South Africa, and it was only in 2010 they came in. So when Jim O'Neill spoke about it, he said that we need to watch out for these countries, and they're going to be the powers of the 21st century when it comes to economic growth. So these are the major things. And finally, the UN and the G7 countries in 1989, they spoke about the Financial Action Task Force, and that was organized. And then we started talking about money laundering. And it's important to look at the definition. We always see as criminology and law people that there is no crime without a law. So we have this definition given by the UN, and it describes money laundering as a conversion or transfer of property, knowing that such property is derived from any offense for the purpose of concealing or disguising the illicit origin of the property, or of assisting any person who is involved in such offense to evade the legal consequences of this action. So when you look at the definition, it's important here because I think it is still not comprehensive enough. We haven't got the word harboring in it, because the trafficking law includes the word harboring. So when we look at it as a country, we see that in the UK, it does not only house our Kohinoor diamond, but it also houses one of our diamond merchants who was involved in money laundering, and he is now there. He's taken refuge in the UK. So we need to get the word harboring in as well and see how, and of course we have an extradition treaty and it's going on, but he has clever lawyers and he's still not brought to the book back in our country, and he is there in the UK. So it's important to pay attention to the definition, and again, we as developing countries, maybe we're not in a position to tell the developed countries what to do. So we need to focus on the definition of this term and include the harboring, because very few cases get convicted. And when they are not brought to the book, and then there is no deterrence. And that is, that doesn't give a message, so to say. So I think that's important, the definition as well. Then of course the causes, we have many studies which talk about the causes. They say it's globalization, they say it's industrialization, liberalization, growth of technology. Of course, growth of technology has contributed an increase of this crime. So yes, those are the causes. Then if you look at victimology, like I say, as a victimless crime, we see that measuring the impact is particularly challenging because we don't have a single victim. And so it doesn't have a face. Victim is faceless in this case. So that's another reason why this is such a huge challenge. And then there are the studies which talk about how money launderers have increased the operation both in the financial services and the non-financial services sectors as well. Then we have studies that say that 2.5% of the global GDP comes from unlawful resources, and that is quite an alarming number. And also that anti-money laundering is a motion which aims to curb, combat, and manage this huge challenge that to prevent money laundering crimes as well. So you see that the huge challenge we face is because of the lack of transparency And there's no cooperation between the countries, even after convictions. If the perpetrators can find a safe haven somewhere else, it does not really help. So we need to understand that that's a difficulty. And then the difficulty of tracking and prosecuting cross-border financial crimes. That's a huge challenge as well. And that's why we use there is the increase in the use of informal financial systems. I don't know if you have that in your countries, but we do in India. It's called the chit funds. And they're not really banks, but there's a person who runs it like a bank. Everybody deposits their money in, and they know the person. It's not an institution, it's a person. So they have faith and trust in them. And then once a month, they have a kind of a lottery, and one of them pick, and I'm sure you have it in other countries as well. It's called the chit fund.
Stockville.
So, and we see that because of this, you see that there is an increased risk of social unrest. There's decreased investment in the regular banks, and decrease in economic growth, the increased risk of terrorism. It's always linked together: terrorism, drugs, trafficking of human beings, and that's where the money from this illegal gains are pumped into. And of course, finally, political unrest as well. So they're able to use these funds to start a political unrest. So you see, these are the impacts of this, and especially increased risk of social unrest we've seen in our country, in other countries as well. So, and reduced trust in the financial system, which is a huge risk as well, because when I talk about these chit funds, we often have it in the news that they have absconded and the people lose their money. So it's not always a very wise thing to do. So when you lose trust with your money, with the institutions, then you tend to be vulnerable to people who prey on the vulnerability of this kind of people. And of course, increased risk in terrorism and the drug trafficking. We know that these funds are used for drug trafficking and human trafficking as well. And you see, wherever you have these money laundering units, it's always in these porous areas where you have very porous borders, and then that is used to fund the terrorism and the drug and arms and the human trafficking as well. So these are a few of the outcomes. And when you look at the cycle, of course, we all know how this dirty money is collected and how it's placed in the financial system. And when you see it's a cycle, and you also call it a structure, money, the stages, the placement, layering, and the integration, how you accumulate the money from illegal activities, place it in a financial system, transfer the money to hide the origin of the funds, and return the money into the system again. Like yesterday, we were driving past the beach and all the sea-facing houses. They say they're not always owned by people from South Africa. I'm sure some of them have been bought with these kind of funds. So this is what happened, offshore housing in Dubai. And you see these are places where they pump their money into. This is how they integrate this money back into the system. And it's evolving. There is no, we're not sure where and how it's going to evolve next. It started with laundromats, and then the Bitcoins, coins, and the cryptocurrencies, the shell companies. That's another huge way in which they hide these funds, and the trade-based money laundering, digital currencies. So it is evolving. We always need to be prepared, and we need to be proactive, because like we all know that the criminals are way ahead of us. So we need to be proactive and think of ways in which we can tackle this. And we, as BRIC nations, the literature shows that we have tried to have regulatory frameworks in place. We've tried to have financial intelligence units. All the BRIC countries do have them, and international standards try to follow the UN's protocols and the best practices as well. But still, it seems to be difficult to get rid of this. Like it's here to stay. It's money laundering and the evils that come with it. It's here to stay. So when you look at Brazil, you see that when you look at the status, the Brazilian government has estimated that between US dollars 20 and 50 million is laundered in Brazil every year through offshore accounts and real estate markets. And there are many, many cases, the criminal gangs which are accused of money laundering, and they say they are well connected, and that's how they're able to launder this money as well. But Brazil does have a lot of laws in place, legislations in place, and they carry a huge sentence as well. And we believe that you give severe punishment and it would change the status quo. But we need to remember that it's not the severity of the punishment, but the certainty of the punishment that can curb this crime. And that doesn't seem to be happening. Maybe we have severe punishments on our statute books, but the certainty is not there. We hardly see any of the money launderers being convicted. And when you look at the score in 2021 was 4.98. It's down from 5.02 the year before. However, the score hasn't dropped from 2018 till now. That's Basel anti-money laundering index that we're talking about. And of course, when you look at the role of Brazilian government entities, they do have a Council for Financial Activities in place. But again, how effective it is something that is debatable. And when you look at the risk, you see that the risk index it has been stable for quite some time, from 2018 to 21. You don't see any signs of it having gone down. So coming to Russia, again, money laundering is estimated to account for around 10% of the country's GDP. And of course, they have many cases there as well. The New York Mellon Corporation that was in the news largely. And the laws, they do have laws in place. And finally, the index, again, it hit a record low after the Financial Action Task Force. They seem to be very effective, and the examination in December 2019 rated the country's anti-money laundering systems as reasonably competent. So they seem to be more effective than in the other BRIC countries, and the government has put in place a Council for Financial Activities Control as well. They have a stringent law as well, and this is the risk index score of money laundering. So you see that in 2022, there is a slight increase. So that's about China. And coming to India, it is a major issue with estimated $30 billion US dollars laundered each year. And much of this money is laundered through the use of false invoices, shell companies, and the real estate market. That's a huge thing in our country now, but now they try to regulate it. And when you buy a property, you pay half in black and half in white. So that is the way the money is laundered. Now they're trying to streamline everything and have the IT involvement and get it done. But otherwise, it was always 40-60 black and white. So that's the huge laundering that happens. I think it happens in most developing nations. That is a huge thing, the real estate market, launder the money. And there are many, many cases that you can talk about. The Punjab National Bank, there was a Satyam Computer scam, and Harshad Mehta. These are all huge cases. And one of the latest ones were the Nirav Modi, the diamond merchant. The conviction has happened, but he hasn't been brought to the book. The other persons, but these are the people that have been convicted. And so there is a lot happening in the judiciary as well, but I guess not substantial enough. And the laws, we do have a Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and it has recently been amended as well. So the amended acts talks about confiscating the property as a part of the sentencing. So that is something new that really should help in deterring this type of crime. Then the index shows a varied trend and has dipped since 2015. And of course, we have the government entities in place. We have intelligence units, and we have a directorate of enforcement, and this falls under the finance ministry directly. So there seems to be some things happening, but still the risk is quite high. Like you can see, in spite of the dip, we have a lot of things in the news about how money laundering is still very, very prevalent in many parts of the country. So when we need to think of curbing these, you need to designate a compliance officer. Most of these institutions, it's the banks, it's the insurance companies that have that are where these money laundering happens and where you can easily detect them as well. So the compliance officers and many of these institutions do not have written policies. That's very, very important. When you need to challenge the written policies are very important. Then capacity building of the employees, because most of the cases that I mentioned, Harshad, Satyam, they were hand in glove with the bank employees. So it is very important. The corruption is linked to this in a large way. So we need to control that as well. And you need to schedule a periodic third-party review in these banks, which sometimes fails to happen. And of course, the risk-based procedures for conducting customer due diligence. That's another thing that has now started happening very frequently, the KYC. It never used to know your customer. So now they've tightened on that. So they keep trying to, we left out China. So China also had a 50 billion US dollars of money laundering each year. And again, false invoices, shell companies and the banking system. And there are many cases. One of it was the Agricultural Bank of China, which was involved in a high-profile money laundering case. That was 2010. And they have the laws in place. And the index demonstrates high risks in relation to both environmental crimes and human trafficking. And they have the laws in place. This is the risk index in China and South Africa. Again, 4% of the GDP. Money laundering is estimated to account for 4% of the GDP, which is quite alarming. And the cases, of course, the Gupta family, and there are many others. So, but lessons are not learned, so that cases can be there, but we need to see that lessons are learned from that. And you have the index again, and the laws are in place, and the risk index seems to be rising here in South Africa, if you have a look at it. So it's not good news. It's not good news. So the UN has taken initiatives. They've first recognized money laundering as a very serious threat to global security. And then they created legal frameworks. You have the United Nations Against Corruption, then organized crime, transnational organized crime. They talk about the procedure for detecting, punishing money laundering and other financial crimes. And the UNODC also provides technical assistance to these countries. But, and the Financial Task Force again develops best practices and international standards. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, also provides technical assistance. The World Bank also provides technical expertise, but we see that it's still not enough. And of course, the national regulatory authorities also enforce anti-money laundering laws, but it doesn't seem to be enough. We need to address the other gaps as well. We see that there are gaps. We need to implement these international conventions, ratify them, and we need to increase the criminalization of financial terrorism. That's not done in most places. You need to set up specialized courts, and especially in countries, overpopulated countries like India, we have the docket explosion. We have loads of cases, and even the Harshad Mehta, it was after he died, till he died, there was no end of that case. The conviction was not. So that's how long it takes. It took about 20 years. So this needs to be speeded up. You need to have specialized courts. So, and you need to have measures to apply financial sanctions. So now you have confiscation of property, which is in the amended act in India. So that seems to be a good step in the right direction. And you need to ratify and implement the relevant international convention, training of law enforcement officers, training of the judiciary on how to appreciate, especially when you have this cyber crimes and you use it so easy. So it's difficult when the judges are not able to appreciate the collection of evidence, the presentation of evidence. So we're doing this in a large way. Our university, the National Forensic Sciences University, is training the criminal justice professionals in new ways of dealing with this crime, of investigating this crime, the cyber crimes, and of course, appreciating the scientific evidence that's presented in court, because lawyers and judges, I think in other countries as well, they do not have a subject called forensic science or forensic medicine in their law curriculum. So now we're trying to incorporate that into it, because largely these crimes are all cyber crimes. So they need to, they're the ones who sit there as gatekeepers in the justice system, and they marshal this evidence in. So whatever pains we take to collect the evidence, when it's presented, the judges need to appreciate it and they need to admit it into our courts of law. So a lot of training is happening there. And of course, ending the impunity. That is a huge thing when there is no deterrence if you do not do that. And the 4 processes to improve anti-money laundering compliance, you need to run risk assessment, and then you need to, the identity, the location of the account, the verification of the account holder, and you need to pay attention to this. And this risk factors, they are not static, they can shift as well. So you need to look at that. And that's something that you need to really train your people in the financial institutions with that. Otherwise, it would be difficult. Then products associated with the accounts, they need to understand how that works as well, and then recognize the signs of money laundering, the large volume of transactions, multiple new accounts. So these are things that need to be trying to use the cyber so that it kind of sends an alarm, sends a signal that there are so many accounts in this, multiple accounts in this particular name, or this person is having a lot of transactions. So these are things they are trying to do, and setting up rigorous anti-money laundering verification processes, screening the customers, screening the employees. So all this while they were focusing on the customers and not looking at the employees. And finally, they have an insider there who's also working with the money launderers. So they need to look at that as well, and implement anti-money laundering and monitoring to see how our accounts work. Then they have a list of known depredators. You need to verify that list, check whether they are on your list of account holders, and investigating and reporting them to if there is an alarm bell that rings. So finally, I think like all other crimes, you need to tackle this, like any crime, like money laundering, happens when there is a motivated offender, lack of capable guardian, and a suitable target. So when we try to tackle money laundering as well, we need to have a three-pronged approach. So try to remove one of these elements, and then money laundering might not happen so frequently as it is happening. So when you talk about motivated offender, you need to end impunity. First of all, the certainty of punishment is important, and you need to strengthen the criminal justice system, and you need to ostracize, stigmatize, and label. Usually in criminology, we talk about rehabilitating the offenders and not labeling them and not stigmatizing them. But as far as money laundering is concerned, I think we need to reverse, and we need to stigmatize them, and we need to ostracize them. So that's what you do with a motivated offender. And when it comes to the suitable target, we need to reduce the vulnerability of countries. The target hardening needs to happen, and we need to address the problems that exist between the banks and the law enforcement, especially concerning this suspicious activity report. So we need to pay attention to that as well. And we need to actually sing from the same page. And we need to understand that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So we need to look at that one employee in the bank who might be vulnerable. And we need to assess the needs that he might be confronted with, and that what might lead him to be involved in this money laundering. And finally, the absence of capable guardians. We need to be a vigilant society. We need to understand that there is no peace without justice. And we need to, when we see something, say something. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we need to focus on this, and maybe we can help prevent money laundering. So when you're looking at the road ahead, the way forward, we need to work together, join hands, and it's an international crime, so you need to have informal sanctions as well, moral concerns. So the convictions on one end and the other, like I was talking about, ostracizing, labeling. So moral concern and socialization plays a large part. We need to relook at our socialization, the way and we need to unlearn and relearn, because we tend to accept little untruths and little not adhering to the morals and values. So we need to rethink that. We need to also launch an effective anti-money laundering campaign. The governments must review relationships between institutions, citizens, businesses, and we need to revise our cross-border payment protocols to see, like Professor, like you were talking about in economics, how you try to reconsider the payment protocols and be more open to feedback from the public. This is something that, especially in the big countries, we need to criticize the government. We need to, and they need to pay attention to what the public say as well. So it is an unlawful activity. It is all pervasive and involves huge financial losses and is a great threat to the security of peace and security of all the nations. So we need to, as BRIC countries, identify what we can do about it. And eventually I'd say that John Bartlett's quote, which is, I've tweaked a bit because he has said that I've gathered a bouquet of men's flowers. I don't know how they got, like feminist research. We look at it and we see that everything had only men in that. So he said men's flowers. And so I've just tweaked it a bit. I've gathered a bouquet from other gardens, and nothing that, but the thread that binds them is mine own. So with that, I welcome you all to India. I hear from Professor Gopal that the next stop would be India. So I hope all of you would be there with us, and it will be in the land of the Mahatma, Gujarat, where our university is headquartered. So we hope to see you all there, and hope to have you there to enjoy the food, the folk music, and the dance that we will have for you when you are there with us. And
Thank you
also
very
the save the date. We are having the World Victimology Symposium in India, in Gujarat. Our university is hosting it. So that would be September 2024. So I take this opportunity to welcome you all there for that symposium as well. And we can have a lot of papers on this and try to include it. And like I said, victimologists have ignored this crime for a long time. Now we need to include that in that symposium as well. So thank you all.
It looks challenging, not only the subject, that is very important for your presentation, but your invitation also. Thank you very much indeed. There are some questions I consider. No? Yeah, welcome.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Jenka. It was really, really good. I actually wanted to add to what you were saying about regulation, about how ICTs are involved. And I think one of the biggest issues is actually cryptocurrency. But specifically, in order to break that chain that you're talking about, what needs to happen is that those identity protocols, there has to be some kind of unified regulation applied across Brics countries, in my opinion, so that unregulated crypto exchanges can't exist. The problem is that I can go on a crypto exchange and make 10,000 accounts. And yes, I'm going to pay some fees, but I can get that money out. And I can do that without, in some instances, not all, having to identify myself. I don't think finger pointing is an effective way of looking at it. I think you just need to look at the regulations of crypto exchanges in the Brics countries. Again, it's not all exchanges, but there are particular ones here and there where regulations are loose. If we can identify people when they make accounts, you can start to break some of those chains. Thank you.
Yes.
Can I add
Yeah,
to
yes.
what you said? I think that might not work because where is the server sitting? Which country is it sitting? There are laws in those countries which might not apply to your country. So that's where the problem is. So sometimes you can identify the problem, but you can't even hold them to account. For example, cryptocurrencies use blockchain, like your digital ledger and all. And there has been a scam in there. They said it's unbreakable, but it is breakable.
It is.
Yes, through agreements. So it's hard to really pinpoint who is doing it. But even when you see the server, if it's from a country whose regulation doesn't work with yours, there's nothing you can do unless you have international relations, which allows you to hold that person accountable.
I see.
We need to look at cross-border protocols. And we do have a lot of faith in the youngsters working with the ICT. So I'm sure we'll get there someday. I don't think it's impossible. Maybe it's a challenge, but I'm sure the computer brains will find something or some way to do it.
Well, Professor Kruger?
Just a question, I'm ignorant on this. How do they get cash into the cryptocurrency?
Exchange your fiat.
It's just like the top.
In the stock market?
Is
Like
that,
this
is that not difficult, is it?
No.
No.
And where
It's
Professor
easy, that's the
Shekar
problem.
was speaking about layering, you can do this through as many accounts as you want to create in some instances like this. And Pizarro is right, with the locations of data centers. But the other thing to think about is that some exchanges in some countries have good protocols in place. And then other exchanges in those very same countries have some loose protocols. So I don't think it's going to solve the problem, but it might help to unify, at least between Brics countries.
We need to have a common protocol and we need to sit together, all the BRIC countries, and devise a way of doing it. And wherever the server is seated, shouldn't matter, I think, now with all the cybercrime. And
Would you say that it might be, or even Pizarro, would you say it might be better to implement the security protocols at the exchange level as opposed to per country or across countries?
cross countries would be the way to go.
It would, yes. But
The thing is, it's going to be cross-country, because most of our payments gateways are not
usually locate, I would say most of them are not in Africa.
I see.
They can be located anywhere. So you can't really say you must comply to what I want. It's company-based. Do you have an agreement with the company? You have to look at the national laws, the international laws.
Yes.
Are you complying? So if Visa is going to provide you a payment gateway, you have a contract with them. So I'm looking for a good example. For example, if you go online and buy something, you have a contract with that platform, not the country.
Sure.
So if anything goes wrong, you can't blame the country's laws. There are laws there to protect people, but you also have to comply on your own side. Or if anything goes wrong, it's with the company. The same thing with cryptocurrency. You don't know who you're trading with. You don't know where the server is sitting. You're doing it based on trust. It's like saying, I don't know you, but based on what I see, I think I kind of trust you with my money. So take it. I've heard the technology is good. So if anything goes wrong, really, the government is kind of 50-50 on how to protect you because you've put yourself out there and accepted the terms and conditions of that platform, which doesn't really help the government to protect you. For example, there was this big time money launderer, Hush Puppy from Nigeria. Because the laws in Nigeria could have made him a criminal and easily allowed the Nigerian government to transfer him to the US government, he ran to the EAU. So the laws there kind of protected him. Forgetting that, the US actually went ahead and said, okay, if you're not going to sit in your country, we're going to talk to these people and try to get you out, maybe an exchange or something. So unless the country really allows you to take that person, there's really nothing you can do as long as you've accepted the terms and conditions of the business. And most money launderers do not work alone, they work as a team. So you can get, yes, so you can get one person, but where are the other people seated? They can do their work remotely in different countries. It may not be in a Brics nation. So even when you have those laws, how do you catch everyone in the team?
We need to relook at the extradition laws and treaties, because it was different then. We just wanted a physical person. Now you need to and when we said the jurisdiction of our laws was if it had an Indian flag, so many nautical miles. Now you need to think beyond that. Not just the nautical miles and not the aircraft that flies over the country or the ship that holds your flag. We need to see where the server is. So we need to really relook at everything. We haven't changed anything in our laws. We haven't looked at the jurisdiction, in spite of the fact that we have our servers sitting all over the world and not able to control it. So what are we doing about it? You need to put your heads together. I cannot do it separately for India, separately for South Africa. The developed nations, the developing nations, everyone needs to sit together and talk.
Again, we come to the conclusion that there is a necessity of harmonization of our regulation in definite spheres to secure the activity of our entities. Professor Kapal wanted to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Irina, and thank you very much, Prof. Shekhar, for that really enlightening presentation. And I want to agree, and I think your last point is particularly significant in that I think we were premature in many ways. And I speak about it globally. We moved into 4IR and now the 5IR, and yet we didn't keep pace in terms of our legislation to manage those processes. For example, we talk about the international laws and the nautical miles, etc., within which we allow the limit that we have in terms of those international laws. Yet we know our servers are sitting in different countries, and we may not necessarily understand the implications of those country laws, etc. So I think a very critical point for us. And the other bit that I want to add to as well is the fact that we as the Brics countries, yes, we understand that we have sovereignty, but then we also understand that we are whether we are a bloc, a corporation, or whatever we want to call ourselves, but we're a group of nations that want to work together. And in terms of working together, we need some common protocols. And I think whether the protocols, how do they speak to international law, for example, in terms of protecting us? Because one of my biggest concerns around money laundering is that it finances activities that destabilize our countries. And like you say, with one of those SDGs on peace and justice, peace and justice, that money laundering can hugely undermine peace and justice, not just in the Brics countries, but globally as well. So this kind of conversation is so critical to start thinking about what are the protocols and how do we start to amend the international laws as well. Now we know that it's it's a process, but we need to start somewhere.
And we have no choice now. It's a do or die situation.
Absolutely.
We need to get together.
Oh, my last point was that whilst we understand that cryptocurrency, the appetite for cryptocurrency may at this time be low, but we know, and that's amongst the wider population, but we know the organized syndicates, their appetite is huge already. And eventually, those of us with poor appetites will start entering the cryptocurrency domain. And I think the opportunities then will increase. So those laws and protocols become increasingly more critical for us. Thank you.
And earlier we had the Swiss banks, so the money would go there. Now we can have it in the form of crypto anyway. Yes. Earlier it was all the Swiss banks that was used.
And
with the secrecy clause as well.
And my last point, speaking to what I think it was Fisayo mentioned, what we're seeing now in the virtual space or the virtual space is just a shift between the physical to the virtual. So the intent, the motivated offender remains.
Yeah.
The
suitable
target remains. The absence of the capable guardian remains. So we just moved from physical to virtual. So I think it's also important then, unfortunately though, the physical laws have not embraced the virtual space. They're not relevant. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Prof. I just want to talk about the issue of, I think it's the routine activities theory, and whether in the ever-changing globalization and other effects, as well as the ever-increasing, the creeping lifestyles of human beings, is not perhaps one that we could look at in order to say that, in terms of suitable targets, the suitable targets may also, I think, let me put it this way, the suitable targets, one needs to also look at it from the perspective of what makes some people become suitable targets, especially in relation to I think you just mentioned something in relation to the marginalized communities, which really suffer from lack of protection from anywhere. And because money laundering in itself is not necessarily, we're not necessarily talking about, we may not be talking about big monies, but we may be talking about very small amounts. So then when we try to question and critique the issue of the suitable targets, the issue of what's the other ones? Absence of guardians. By living in certain zones where some people are regarded as human, whereas some people are regarded as non-human, then what happens in those spaces where people, by virtue of their status, by virtue of their lifestyle, generally just do not have any protection at all? So what then becomes their vulnerability areas? Then how can we then maybe try to reconceptualize and rethink the way in which these theories themselves, served certain purposes? For instance, served to protect, even within these theories, served to protect the global South compared to the minorities in the global norm. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing that you said, and it's important to see that all these vulnerable groups
Yes.
who are going to be the victims of terrorism, victims of human
yes,
trafficking,
yes.
victims of drug trafficking. So these are the group of vulnerable people who are going to. So if we don't stop this, they are funding this.
Yes.
So we are feeding the tiger that's going to eat these vulnerable
absolutely,
people. So
absolutely.
that's why we need to really pay attention to this. Because the last victim is going to be the underprivileged, the marginalized,
yes.
Poorest of the poor.
Anyway, just I would also like to comment and just probably to put a question. Thing is that you mentioned that law prevails, and no peace. Just
no justice without
peace. No justice without peace. Well, I
peace
really
without
share this definition, but it's very difficult to identify those who are within the process of money laundering. For example, just after the tragedy that happened in the US on the 11th of September 2001, the company, the bank, was prosecuted with its client within the process of knowing your company and your clients. Because they were issuing laws to the company that suggested courses for pilots. And they were just the pilots who participated in this strategy. It's really difficult to identify. My question is that, starting from the Wolfsberg principles, gathering of the financial institutions after that incident, that drama that happened in the United States, there was the Wolfsberg principles signed by the financial institutions within the principles of managing just your customers' activity and supervising it and things like that. Within that, there were three main principles: to pay attention to the companies and take into consideration, as you have mentioned, the activity concerning drugs production and transportation, illegal type of, then weapons production, transportation, and smuggling. After that, within the laws that appeared in different countries on the basis of these Wolfsberg principles that were addressed just to international, to global institutions, International Monetary Fund, and things like that. Just there were only three principles at the beginning. Then in the countries, some other activities were included. And those who avoid tax payment, they are also considered to be money launderers, and they are also prosecuted. Do you think it's reasonable to split these two activities that concerns drugs, weapons, smuggling, and just the violation of some regulations that concerns fiscal activity on entities? You have mentioned, well, just the houses on the bank and in Dubai that are bought, just things like that. But probably it's another story. What do you think about it?
I think the vigilance is important. To look at the transactions, you need to observe. You can't have different laws, but you need to be vigilant and to watch out for these transactions. And yes, with the black money is what paid. So now that's a challenge. Looking at it to see.
Because some countries, the European countries, consider that it should be split. Because one is just the case of money laundering that should be prosecuted by one kind of institutions, and the other is just by another.
There is a thin line, so you wouldn't really know when it is just the money laundering funds, or is it the other financial frauds.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me have a look if there are questions online. No, there is an indication that the sound transmission is rather poor and interrupted online. But anyway, I see again that Professor Warner had a question. Probably it had it before because this is the last one. And probably that belonged to another presentation. But anyway, if Professor Wouter online, probably you would like to put the question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Professor Shekhar, thank you for presenting this excellent webinar. And you have also proposed some solutions which are excellent. May I just raise a point that while all these different mechanisms can be put in place, if there is high level corruption at the level of governments, and you have mentioned some of these, and I'll talk about something just now, it's impossible to tackle money laundering in a proper coordinated manner internationally and intergovernmentally. Now, having said that, I note that you listed each of the countries, including South Africa, India, and Brazil. And basically, in the international community, at the moment, with due respect to my own country of origin and birth, it's regarded as the epicenter of all corruption globally. So it's a serious problem. Now, if you look at India, the recent scandal involving Gautam Adani, the multi-billionaire from India, and who is reported to be a close ally of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is kind of involved in a credibility crisis based on the research carried out by a US company that looks into stock market scandals and covert operations and so on. Hindenburg Research, I think it's called. And they actually reported formally accusing Adani Group in India of having engaged in stock market manipulation, accounting fraud, and even money laundering. Now, here we have a multi-billionaire who is well respected in India and who is a close ally of the Prime Minister of the ruling party, BJP, who is involved in this sort of activity. It's coming from a reputable company. The report is emanating from a reputable company in the United States. We cannot ignore this. So the bottom line is that high-level fraud and money laundering, as you rightly described the history from the time of Al Capone and company, is actually not going to go away until there's a political cleanup. And this is not happening. This is not happening at all. And the end result is that the poor remain where they are. They're in fact getting poorer. And you recall the figures that were the astounding figures that were mentioned of the profits gained by the richest people in the world during the COVID crisis, disempowering the poor even further and leading to an economic meltdown globally of different economies, but more so it is affecting the poor people throughout the world. So we need to get to the level of high government corruption and eradicate that. We need to eradicate that because even here in South Africa, there were reputable auditing companies that were involved in the scandal involving the Gupta scandals and state capture and so on. Now, these things could only happen if there is government involvement. And furthermore, we may have diligent officers in these offices, in these places, in these corporations, who may whistleblow, and then they run the fear of being terminated, as it has happened to one of my good friends in South Africa. And those of you who may remember this case will know that she was shot down mercilessly as she returning home. I think it was from leaving her children in the school in one morning. And basically, nothing has happened of that. So it's a high-level corruption. It's impossible to counteract money laundering. And while we have all these protocols, and you have eloquently and very succinctly presented, Professor Shekhar, these protocols that you can put into place, there are various levels of possible irregularities, not only involving companies responsible for auditing and so on, but also, literally speaking, the low-level employee in a big company. So this is something, it's a scourge, it's a modern-day scourge of our society, which is impoverishing our disadvantaged communities globally. Now, you remember in Brazil, we have a bipolar community as well, where you have the very rich, the very poor. In South Africa, it's the same story. In India, you have multi-billionaires, yet others are sleeping in drain pipes. You have the Dalit populations there who are untouchables. In China, you have again all these irregularities. So we can form our Brics union, and we can form and we can have these meetings, and we can propose different protocols. But we need to get to the root cause of these evils, because if we don't do something about it, a revolution will arise. A revolution will arise, and all our protocols will be of no use at all. Thank you very much. I appreciate some comments on what I have said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And there is, oh yeah, oh, come on.
Thank you, Professor Wagner. Regarding your comments, first thing, as a professor of criminology and as a lawyer as well, I'd like to say that we need to respect the principles of natural justice. So regarding that accusation that you spoke about, I did not mention, because I believe in Audi Alton pattern, you need to give them a chance to respond, and it is just an allegation. So that's the reason I did not speak about that. And coming to your next point, yes, it reminds me of the book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison. It's by Jeffrey Remain. It's a very interesting book. So yes, that's the reality. And sometimes it's just the narratives that are built. And like you said, the Dalits are discriminated against in our country. But right now, the president, the woman who's the president right now, she is a tribal woman. So you can't really rely on narratives all the time. Sometimes you need to have a reality check as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There's Mr. Tokozani. If you are online, will you be so kind as just to comment, to contribute with your proposal?
Just
Welcome.
Just a comment. With a common protocol, there'll have to be a common agency that looks at prosecuting and investigating, as well as enforcing any of the protocols that you want to put in place. And that's going to be more of a parliamentary thing rather than, so each individual country would have to come up with a list of their own protocols and see in what based on our commonalities in economic ethics, what the protocol would be. But a Brics enforcing and prosecuting agency, when it comes to money laundering, would mainly look at inter-country or international money laundering rather than intranational money laundering. So money laundering that's happening within the countries would then, that'd be a responsibility of each country's law enforcement agencies rather than the Brics law enforcement agency. A Brics law enforcement agency would have to look at international crimes of money laundering, illegal enrichment, etc. Because that would be more in its scope of work in terms of, if you're talking about security, one of the significant security threats that we currently face in each country within the Brics nations is regime change and state capture and resource capture as well. So it's more than just money laundering being used by criminal syndicates through the various crimes, human trafficking, etc. But it's also got to do with countries or foreign entities that are actually using that money to fund certain entities to disrupt local politics to take over certain resources and or political or influence certain decisions in countries. And I think we're all susceptible to that. And the urgency and importance of a common Brics prosecuting agency would be to look at, in general, economic crimes within the international communities, more specifically as they affect individual Brics countries, but not necessarily internal financial crimes, because that would then be left to the own individual countries' local law enforcement agencies. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Thank you,
Very
Mr. Rani.
Do you have some
Yes, I
remarks
can
here?
just respond to that. So, yes, I don't think we can compartmentalize each of the countries and say money laundering, it's their individual problem, because it does involve international and transnational crimes like trafficking and terrorism as well. And we can think in the lines of the International Criminal Court we have in Hague. That's for the crimes against humanity. Now maybe we need to think in that lines for economic crimes, because they impact so much and the magnitude is also huge. I mean, it is a challenge. So maybe we can go that way. We need to put our heads together. That's what we were discussing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Irina. And I think, Thokozani, thank you very much for those really provocative questions and comments. And I think it's allowing this group to think in more lateral ways as well. I like the point that Prof. Shekhar just mentioned when she refers to the International Criminal Court, which deals with crime against humanities. But I think there's an obtuse link between money laundering and its impact on humanity. So how do we bring that back into the ICC, I think is an important conversation for us to have. The second point I want to make, and Thokozani rightfully points out that the discussion of a Brics protocol will happen, or has to happen at Parliament level. So just in terms of understanding, Brics is not sitting at our level, at an academic level, but it does sit at a national level, at parliamentary level. So it's 5 countries, it's the governments of 5 countries that come together. So it has to be taken to the parliaments of the various countries. And my last point is that when you speak about, the state capture and how that feeds into and fits into money laundering, etc. I think one of the notions that we get confused about is that whether it's a low level, whether it's money laundering through drugs or human trafficking, etc., versus money laundering at the state level through state capture. In both those scenarios, we have criminals, we have perpetrators. But unfortunately, I think on the one level, the one that involves state capture, we forget to call them the criminals or the perpetrators. And perhaps that's where the tension exists. But if we really if we view them through a criminology lens, both of them are actually perpetrators. So I wanted to put that on the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to add to that, I think we need to have another on our list, advocacy. That's important as well. Like, since we need to move with the government, move with the parliament, advocacy also needs to come into our to-do list. And also as researchers, we need to produce the numbers so that they would have a policy change. So if we need to promote this kind of a policy, we need to have figures and we need to do some research and show them that this is what is happening. And so we need to do something about it, maybe take it to the members of the legislature assembly. And
at the beginning, it's the question of the central bank of any country, of any Brics country also. So if to address to somebody, it's central banks, and then they just have the initiative to probably change something as far as the juridical background of the country is concerned. it's reasonable to do something with us. Okay.
I think the onus does lie on us as researchers, because any policy should be based on research, and they hardly take our research into account. They have their own agencies doing the research. But then we need to also spruce up and
To push and pay attention to
pay attention to our research. It should be error-free. We need to make it foolproof. Not have any loopholes.
in spite of our getting off time, there's Professor Wagner that would like to put his question, and will you be so kind if you are online? I have the information that you would like to add something or just to put a question. Professor Wagner?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I actually like the idea of Professor Shekh's intimation that we need to have a combined multinational force to combat money laundering. May I inquire if Professor Shekha is proposing something like the Interpol, more specifically to tackle money laundering globally? And the other point to note is that we all talk about terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and various other ones operating in Nigeria and so on, about money laundering, but it's not them actually money laundering. They are using much more effective and primitive communication methodologies. For example, following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad airport by United States, people now have stopped using cell phones and emails and so on. They are using CBs, the old-fashioned CB radios to communicate. So I think this idea of money laundering going used by terrorist organization is actually an eyewash by various governments to detract us from the real white-collar criminals that are operating right amongst us. And I think that needs to be targeted. So here we have agencies who are responsible at government level involved in money laundering. And we are deflecting, or they are deflecting, the crime to terrorist organizations. Not to say that the terrorist organizations are not active in their heinous activities, but it's something that we need to be vigilant of and think about. But coming back to Professor Shekh's suggestion of a combined force, do you think that's possible? Noting that even Interpol has its limitations of inside informers working in collaboration with criminal elements globally, and in corrupt countries, this would be a farcical situation because it would be kind of passed on to the criminal organizations that are involved in money laundering. Do you think that's practical and pragmatic? Thank you.
I think Interpol, this is already on their portfolio. We don't need another one like Interpol. Interpol has this also on their portfolio, so they need to look into this as well. And of course, what you said is accurate when you say that these money launderers do have godfathers in the government. So yes, that needs to be appreciated as well.
Thank you very much.
Your contribution. As you know, I'm a healthcare practitioner, so I'm not a criminologist, but criminology is my hobby horse. And I commend, I admire. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We really appreciate the participation of those who are online at the moment. And as far as I see, Mr. Takahashi has a comment. Yeah, will you be so kind as Mr. Tokozani? Excuse me, Mr. Tokozani.
No, just one more, the last comment. I understand that there's Interpol and there is the International Criminal Court that exists within or amongst the other UN agencies. The one concern that we have is that the UN and members of the UN have shown impartiality in the way they address certain crimes against humanity in general across the world. There's been an unfairness in the way that they treat crimes done by certain international agencies or entities. Hence the BRICS nations. So within the BRICS nations, if we have our own common ethic in terms of what is right and what is wrong, we can exercise justice in a more impartial manner within the smaller international community rather than the larger international community with global players who have different goals and agendas to what we have as the BRICS complex.
I think I've switched this off. I hope you can hear me. I think we need to be cautious and not lose faith in these institutions and throw the baby out with the bathwater. So yes, there are some hitches, but we cannot really discount the role of these agencies.
Thank you very much indeed. If there is nothing else, I would like to thank all of you for your participation. That was extremely interesting, and your presentations prepared on the basis of your research. They are of a great interest and a profound contribution to our mutual study. Thank you very much for that. And let me close the session and have a break. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila.